You're listening to the Ecocide Report, a monthly podcast from Stop Ecocide International and the Movement for Ecocide Law. Stop Ecocide International is working tirelessly to get ecocide recognised by the International Criminal Court, but we need your help. If you value this content or want to support the work of Stop Ecocide International, you can become a patron over at patreon.com for just 1 hour's wage per month. Your support makes our work possible, and we can't thank you enough.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 4 of the Ecocide Report. I'm here with my co-host Jojo Mesa. My name is Chidi Obihara, and we're going to be discussing a range of really prescient topics. But I think we should start probably with some of the work that you did last year at the ICC. Did you want to speak about that?
Absolutely. So we put on a key side event during the ICC's annual assembly in The Hague at the beginning of December in 2022. And this is not the first time we've done this. We've put on events there over the last few years, and of course the ICC is the key forum for us. Obviously our key goal is to drive and facilitate the introduction of ecocide into the Rome Statute, that is a governing document of the International Criminal Court. That's what we're all about. So their annual assembly is a really, really key forum for us. It was also the place in 2019 where the Ocean Republic of Vanuatu became the first country to call for this on the international stage at the ICC, so at that assembly. So on this occasion, we were co-hosting, again with the Republic of Vanuatu, an event which was speaking to the relevance of ecocide as a fifth crime in the context of global crisis and the future of the ICC. And we were actually given the plenary hall to do our event in, and that is a really key marker of how seriously the court is taking this issue. And we had a fabulous lineup. We had Princess Esmeralda of Belgium moderating. We had lawyer Philippe Sands and former ICC President Chili Ebosuji. We had Professor Darrell Robinson, who was instrumental in setting up the International Criminal Court. And we also had a fantastic youth voice, Josh Oxby, also speaking. So it was an incredible lineup. And we had 50 states or so in the room for that conversation. So it was a really, really key marker. And we've also, I think, for the possibly third or fourth year in a row, broken attendance records for a side event there, because that was also going out online. So we just had an amazing reception for that event. So that was really super important. And I think it also, as I say, it shows how seriously the court is taking it, and the whole concept of ecocide is now very much kind of popping up in conversations, in and around that whole conference. So yeah, I think we can definitely talk about a gathering of momentum in that key forum. Excellent.
That's really excellent. One of the key underlying themes of global discussions about environmental economics, environmental politics, and of course all of the call to actions that come with creating a safe and livable ecosphere for all of us, is this idea about the tensions between short-term priorities and long-term priorities. Did you feel any of those sorts of tensions while you were at the ICC?
Interestingly, what that's bringing to mind particularly is where we ended up in January, actually, alongside the Davos World Economic Forum conference. And I'll actually come back to that in a minute, because I'll talk for a moment about an event that was sort of in between those two, that kind of, in a sense, sort of bridges those issues. And that was COP15 in Montreal, the Biodiversity COP, where we ran a series of events, including one that focused on an issue that was very salient in the light of your question, and that was an event around the business case for ecocide law. And that was really like the opening of the discussion, in a sense, at the public level, of how business can engage in this conversation. And of course there is this tension between the bottom line and what we need to do to move to a sustainable civilization. So it was really good to open up that conversation in Montreal, and we had some fabulous voices doing that, including Gonzalo Munoz, who you used to be one of the high-level climate champions, and Sophie Dembinski from Ecocide, also Farouk Ullah from B Team was there at a personal capacity, a really fantastic event. And it started to open up those discussions. We all know you can't, apply to a government and say, can I kill 500 people for my new, infrastructure project? It's not even going to cross our minds. So obviously, the profitability of a business is always tempered by what is permitted within criminal law. So bringing this additional parameter into play will actually make things easier in terms of what a business can consider in terms of its future practices, for example, where an investor is going to put their funds, what an insurer is going to underwrite, all of those things. It's a very helpful parameter to put in place. And this was something that then obviously emerged very strongly in an event that we did at Davos, at the World Economic Forum. We were not part of the Congress itself, but we held an event in the town that was also supported by Systemic, a well-known strategic consultant to governments and business around system change. So that was a really positive and interesting bridging event, really, to sort of bring that discussion within the sort of remit or the ambit of those key financial influencers. So that was a new level of discussion for us.
Excellent. So that thematic follow through, if you like, going from the ICC through to Davos via Montreal, is really important because it's an overriding theme. Stop Ecocide is a profoundly important, I'd say, fundamental part of any kind of policy arena that talks about sustainability and environmentalism. But that question about what sustainability means in terms of horizons just keeps coming up. So would you like to talk maybe in a bit more detail about how you felt about the Cumin Montreal communique when COP15 was over? Did you feel that there were elements of that communique that amplified your message, or that you could amplify in the work that you're doing?
I think so, very much. I mean, it's been described as the most sort of ambitious framework in terms of protecting nature that's ever been agreed on an international level. And it was incredibly encouraging to see, for example, how strongly the Indigenous considerations and voice emerged in that global biodiversity framework. So that was really important. Ecocide was not mentioned specifically, but there was a strong kind of undercurrent, during the conference of, it sort of popping up in conversations. And obviously, with our events, we were joining quite a lot of those dots, and we had also some amazing Indigenous speakers with us there as well. I think the other thing that was very important from the perspective of the moving forward the Ecocide initiative is that it was also at Montreal that I think we again had a bit of a sort of step change in how the diplomatic discussions are going forward, because we've obviously been working hard over the last over recent years to bring state representatives together around this issue, but emerging from Montreal, we actually had a situation where Vanuatu's climate minister publicly declared that they're in conversation with Belgium, which is also a front runner in this conversation, about building an informal coalition and around moving this forward. And that's not just us speaking with states, that's states speaking with each other. And of course, the governments are the ones who have got to move this forward. It is ultimately, a collective, move of governments that needs to happen. So this was a key sort of shift, I guess, in a very positive sense. And that also emerged from Montreal.
Thank you for that answer. I think it's really heartening to know that international fora like COP15 have started to lay the foundation for greater things, more ambitious calls to action. So within that context, are there elements of some of the work that you saw done that you'd like to see amplified in COP16, for example, next year?
Without question. I mean, we would have loved to have seen Ecocide actually mentioned in the text. And obviously, the global biodiversity framework is not it's not a piece of legislation. It's about targets and it's about policy and so on. But what would be really helpful, for example, is for a mention of because there's a whole discourse around whole of government approach, moving the whole of society in a certain direction. And what would be super helpful would be to have ecocide law mentioned as one of the things that can really help with that. In other words, putting a criminal law in place that sets these outer parameters will help all of those other targets to materialize, all of those other policies and attitudes to kind of coalesce. So it's about seeing ecocide law not as a separate element or as something that competes with these other aspects, but rather as something that supports them all.
100%. I think the idea of understanding biodiversity protection, both from the point of view of creating those reserves of 30% of the Earth's surface dedicated to flora and fauna and protection of biodiversity, but also, as you say, laying a floor beneath which we shouldn't go. It's very difficult to be in the middle of quite a serious deforestation emergency and then talk about expanding forestry elsewhere. It's sort of, in my opinion, I think the priority should be things like stopping ecocide. Certainly where flora and fauna are concerned. But I'm really happy that you had that experience. But there's even more going on across Europe right now. How are you involved in the European Crime Directive?
This is a very interesting question at the moment because the whole discussion is very live in the EU. So the EU is in the process of revising its directive on the protection of the environment through criminal law. So in other words, environmental crime directive. And it's a perfect opportunity while the rulebook is open for revision, if you like, to insert a crime of ecocide into EU law. So this is something that we've been campaigning on, that we've been working on supporting the EU committees to kind of discuss this and move it forward. And it's a very live discussion. Already 4 out of the 5 parliamentary committees that are tasked with sort of being consulted on this before it goes to the plenary session in the Parliament, 4 out of 5 of those committees have already said that they want to see ecocide included in that directive, which is fantastic momentum. There is still the one key committee left, which is the one whose text will ultimately go forward to the plenary, and that is the Legal Affairs Committee, and that vote will take place in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. In March, and then that text, whatever text they put forward, will get discussed by the Parliament in April. And so, of course, it's not set in stone, but there's a lot of momentum, and there's a strong sense that there's the possibility that ecocide crime could be included under that directive. And there are various ways that people can support that as well. So there's a petitioned organisation called We Move in Europe that has a live petition around this issue that has well over 75,000 signatures already. Please do obviously go and join that petition. That there's also we've brought out a position paper around this that can also be endorsed by organisations, individuals, and so on. And we're also encouraging people to write to the MEPs that are involved in that Legal Affairs Committee, for example, to encourage them to include ecocide as part of what they put forward and recommend. There's also ways of there's a fantastic little video that people can share online, to encourage people to support this. So there's plenty of scope for supporting that advocacy, but that's also looking really quite positive at the moment. And there's been another development, in fact, 2 other developments in Europe over the last few weeks, which could make also a significant difference in this discussion. So one is that the Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Parliament, is a different body. It's the body that from which the European Convention on Human Rights and the Court of Human Rights emerged. And it has 46 member states, and it has a parliamentary assembly which met in January to discuss a paper, a report around environmental damage in wartime. So the environmental impact of armed conflict. And one of the themes that runs throughout that paper is that a standalone crime of ecocide is both needed and desirable in order to address the awful kinds of damage that take place during war, during any wars. But of course, very live in most people's minds will be the war in Ukraine, where there's been really significant environmental harm created. And UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, has done a whole kind of report on that as well. And so, that was one of the sort of threads, obviously, that was emerging in this report. But it's a very strong endorsement that the Parliamentary Assembly gave. There were nobody stood against that. It was almost unanimously passed, just a couple of abstentions, and so that gives another kind of advocacy piece in the European context of another whole, in a sense, arena where ecocide as a standalone crime is hugely applicable, because war is hugely ecocidal. So that was very important. And then I think it's also really important to mention that we've had another model law project complete in the last week, actually. It's just been published by a prestigious law institute called the European Law Institute. Now, this institute's been around since 2011, and it's an independent institute, and it's made up of over 100 sort of institutional members, over 1,500 members of the legal profession around Europe, and its aim is to sort of research and develop law specifically relating to the EU. And they've just brought out a model law on ecocide specifically focused on the EU. In other words, it draws a lot of inspiration from the international definition that our foundation convened the drafting of, but it focuses specifically on how that would fit into the EU context, with particular sort of procedural aspects and council decisions that would need to be made. And that's all been set out by the European Law Institute, which is obviously wonderfully timely at this moment and could be, very helpful, possibly instrumental in helping to bring the decision around whether the European Crime Directive will include ecocide or not, is taken forward. So that's also hugely exciting.
That's excellent. So we're seeing a sort of a thematic sort of arc, if you like, the sort of issue of juggling both economic and political short-term and long-term issues, but also really interestingly, we've gone from the European Council to the EU to the ICC. Mm-hmm. Different bodies, all considering the same things, but it creates momentum.
Absolutely. And I think this is really important because we're starting to see that this is emerging at the national level, for example, in Belgium, where the government is discussing right now. They've put forward a proposal to legislate in Belgium for ecocide. So the national level, but the regional level with the EU, and then, of course, the international level at the ICC. And I think what we're seeing here is a clear direction of travel. And even quite conservative politicians have been saying to us for some time, we know this is coming. It's just a question of, exactly how and when. And that is, now starting to sort of pop up in so many different fora that this is really becoming an inevitability. And it has to. If we are going to move to a sustainable civilization, it is an absolutely key parameter that we have to have in place. So it's ultimately not surprising that it's popping up in all these different arenas. And, we consider our job to be effectively accelerating the inevitable, rather than sort of dropping anything new into the mix. We're essentially saying, look, guys, we can see this is coming. Let's look at how this is actually going to shape us steering positively in the direction of safety and also in the direction of protection of the living world and of future generations, so that our children and our grandchildren can actually grow up in a world that functions. It really sometimes is as obvious as that. Our work at Stop Ecocide is very much about advocacy, about bringing this conversation to as many different sectors, as many different forums, as many different geographies as possible. But at the core of it is a kind of a no-brainer. It's like, this actually has to happen if we're going to move forward as a civilization.
100%. I think the fact that in the past we've had development pathways that have been quite nationally focused, quite human-centric, quite economic, and tend to miss the obvious sort of symbiosis of life. You can't have this biomass of animal life without having that biomass of forestry. They have to exist together. It's designed that way. So working in a system that allows you to coordinate a broader sense of solidarity, pulling lots of people together to realize the obviousness of the facts, is really heartening. So I think the extra value Stop Ecocide International brings to all of these disparate fora is keeping that underlying theme, allowing people to join the dots. I think perhaps there's no other place where you join the dots better than when you focus specifically on business for ecocide law. Are there key actors and key calls to actions you'd like to amplify in that particular forum?
Definitely, and it's very important. That particular the corporate and business sector is very, very important because, of course, politicians are constantly aware of how their country is doing economically, whether sort of competitiveness, success, all of these things, and so the consultation there is always going to be present. And what we want, of course, is for when politicians are turning to those corporate leaders and those influencers and saying, okay, guys, how do you feel about this law? They need to know about it. They need to be familiar with it. They need to understand that it actually creates a positive strategic framework, which allows them to ask the questions that they know need to be asked, in each sector. This is, of course, where the definition comes in handy because it's so concise, the international definition, that it fits on a business card and people can sort of look at it, and if they're an expert in their sector, they're asking the right questions immediately because they're seeing it as a lens. And we have examples of sustainable leaders in business already coming on board. Triodos in the banking sphere, Vivo Barefoot in clothing, Ecocide in the tech sphere. All of these kind of front-running names. But as we go, we fully anticipate more and more businesses coming behind this direction of travel.
That's excellent. I think it's really good to name best practice. Because it shows other people, if you like, a roadmap to making better choices in future. And as you say, the great thing about underlying the criminal law framework within which business progress is made is that it gives business more certainty in planning. It allows them to be more sure-footed in the things that they do. And so within that context, we can talk about businesses that are directly dependent or directly focused on nature, almost as their raison d'etre. We could talk about farming and land networks, for example. Are there anything is there anything sort of key in that area that you wanted to amplify?
Definitely, because one of the things that we're doing is bringing this conversation into different sectors in a more conscious way. And farming and land is one of the networks that we're beginning to grow around the theme of ecocide law and looking at it. And we actually launched our farming and land network just recently with an event in the UK, but with key voices from the Soil Association, which certifies organic farming in the UK. We had a remarkable inspirational farmer known as Regen Ben talking about regenerative agriculture. We had the Food Farming and Countryside Commission also taking part in that. So, there are some sort of key voices already kind of, joining into that conversation. And of course, this is all about, with ecocide law, it's not about sort of pointing fingers at specific people or specific sectors per se. It's about setting a parameter where all sectors can look at what at this framework and say, what do we need to do within our area in order to use this in a positive way, in order to know what we need to change in terms of our practices. So it's often not about the what, it's about the how, and it's about the how much, in terms of scale, for example. The way that the current sort of legal frameworks exist in the agricultural sector, for example, it kind of it almost can encourage people to not follow even the regulations that are currently in place, and effectively to be pressured to produce more for less and all of these things. And of course, when you take that to the industrial level, you lead to some of the most polluting practices that exist on the planet. So it's very important to reset those frameworks so that that steer starts to go in a different direction.
So in my life and in my roles and the people that I encounter, one of the areas that we constantly try and get people to think about are areas where there are co-benefits between their own specific climate call to action and other climate call to actions. The challenge with these co-benefits is that if the benefiting parties aren't well coordinated, you don't get those co-benefits. They get splintered off into different groups who don't necessarily know the other ones there. So a key example, as you've already mentioned in the farming and land network, is the idea that there might be farmers who, in doing work to prevent ecocide on their land, also benefit indigenous people, indigenous habitats, indigenous flora and fauna, and groups that benefit from that don't necessarily come together and amplify each other's efforts in a way that expand the co-benefits. So I hate to use tired business phrases like, make sure they get the synergies just right. But that's actually exactly what it is.
Yeah,
and that network does that.
I think this is really important. I mean, I think a large part of what we actually do in practice is investigating those synergies. And everything we do is collaborative. All the events that we put on are always with, groups of partners who are, in that sector or, in that, area of the conversation. And it's absolutely key. I think this is absolutely fundamental, is that, if we stay in a kind of siloed mentality, we will never make the changes that are needed. It has to be a collaborative effort. And, that sort of coming together of the different aspects of the conversation, like the indigenous perspective, for example, the region agricultural perspective, the sustainable business perspective, all of these perspectives coming together, all help to acknowledge the part that, ecocide law can play in all of that context, and actually, as you say, bring those co-benefits. So yeah, I think that's an absolutely key aspect, is that collaborative factor.
Could you talk in a bit more detail about the Oceans for Ecocide Law Network as well?
With regard to the Ocean for Ecocide Law Network, we anticipate a major launch around World Ocean Day on the 8th of June. But in the meantime, we're obviously gathering support for an oceans focus letter, the open letter, so that those organisations who are working with marine ecosystems and with the ocean in various ways can come on board with that. So that's another big invitation there. And we're also going to be holding events in the interim. We're doing a webinar next week at the beginning of March, which will involve legal voices, Indigenous voices, conservation voices around the ocean and focusing on protecting the ocean. And that, of course, is a subject very close to the heart of the Republic of Vanuatu, who will again be collaborating with us on that. And they are really carving a niche for themselves in championing legal avenues to address the global crisis of climate and ecology. So it'll be a pleasure to be working with them then and over the coming months too.
That's excellent. I was actually going to say that that's one of those areas where the co-benefits just skyrocket really, really almost exponentially, because as we all know, mangrove and waterway ecosystems have the joint benefits of being helpful and useful to indigenous people for their flora and for their fauna, but also as natural flood defences.
Yeah.
They also serve as nurseries for seagoing fish, and so they encourage livelihoods and cultures that have existed for centuries to be able to flourish in a sustainable way. I think that it may be possible actually to summarize the arc of what you're doing, the arc of what you've done and your current ambitions, as having gone from the broad thematic foundation of stopping ecocide globally to working with different political groups in different regional centres, centering around Europe for obvious reasons, but also pivoting very, very nicely, I think really effectively as well, to these little hubs in industry that also pull business along and make sure there's that sort of coordination between multinational entities and international government. I think that it would be really amazing to find out, absolutely certainly on the 2nd of March, how your broadcast goes, but also by next year at COP16, if we can get together a proper call to action, demand that we have a Stop Ecocide element to the communique, the next biodiversity COP communique. That would be amazing.
Absolutely. And as we understand it, the biodiversity element is also going to be brought into the next climate COP, COP28 in United Arab Emirates. And interestingly for us, that coincides with the International Criminal Court, the ICC's annual assembly this year, which will be in New York. So we would say, just sort of to prime people, that, you know, by that point, we anticipate there being some kind of major, potentially multi-state announcement that we are working towards. So I think that could be very exciting.
It's incredible. It's incredible momentum.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely right. And if you're interested in following this momentum, one of the channels that you can use is YouTube, because we often record the events that we do and we put them all up on our YouTube channel, Stop Ecocide International. So you can actually watch or rewatch some of these events that we've been talking about on YouTube. So join us there.
You've been listening to the Ecocide Report. You can find out more about all of the issues discussed in this episode via the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.